Welcome to Hello Happiness and to our 5th episode where we take you to Ecstasy. Hello Happiness is the podcast series that's all about positive emotions from Welcome Collection, the free museum and library that inspires us to think and feel differently about health. I'm Bidisha, I'm a broadcaster and filmmaker, and I have to admit I'm a bit scared of the word ecstasy. It sounds a bit full on, as if you have to be some kind of hedonistic wild child to get there. And I'm not sure I could out-party Annie McManus, aka the legend that is DJ Annie Mac, the former Radio 1 presenter who kicked off our Friday nights by bringing dance music to millions every week. For her, the journey to ecstasy started with a teenage revelation.
I was 17 when I went to a proper nightclub for the first time, and it was a kind of transformative experience for me. Everything about it was hugely intense, from walking into this room, which was pretty much like a black box, lights flashing, faces, limbs moving in the dark. It took a while for the volume of the music to become normal. I describe it now as like the similar shock to kind of jumping into cold water. There's a real reaction to the loudness of it at the start, but then it kind of gets in you and powers you from the inside out, and you're kind of locked into the rhythm and you feel it in your chest, And I remember really vividly meeting 2 girls from my year who I wasn't friends with at all, and them kind of welcoming me in there as if it was some kind of secret club that only they knew about. And I remember walking home afterwards and feeling like nothing was ever going to be the same again. I weighed myself when I got home and I'd lost 4 pounds in one night. It just felt like I'd kind of shed a skin.
How important was it that the experience was shared? I mean, you could listen to the same music at the same volume alone in your bedroom. It wouldn't be the same, would it?
It's definitely something to do with the collective euphoria. The crowd whooping and hollering and clapping. The actual structure of the music, which is designed to give you these rushes. The music kind of swells and withdraws like a wave. You feel that energy rise up and kind of fall away within you. And then also the idea of repetitive beats, the very primal instinct of the beat of a drum, paralleling your own heartbeat. There's something very primal about dancing to dance music, the hypnotic nature of it, the meditative nature of it. You're so much in the present, and it really means that you feel everything very deeply.
You've mentioned lots of different elements about the euphoric experience, and we've been dancing around this a tiny bit because, of course, we're talking about euphoria and ecstasy, and ecstasy is the name of a very popular drug within dance culture. Could you say a little bit about the effects of this notoriously happy-making substance as you saw it working through the crowd? Does it blend with the music, or did it work against the music to be chemically enhanced?
Yeah, it's really interesting seeing how drugs can affect a crowd and kind of learning about the behavior of a crowd in accordance to what drugs they're taking. Ecstasy, it is designed to work with music, right? It kind of enhances the entire musical experience, and dance music has been designed in parallel with people discovering ecstasy. So the idea of breakdowns and drops, these are all things, this kind of a swelling of the music and then the withdrawing of it and then the kind of crashing in of it. These are all things that go hand in hand with being on ecstasy. And the crowd, when they're on it, respond really, really, really well to dance music. They can dance for longer. They have more energy. They don't really want to booze that much, so they're not falling about. They're not leery. They're not aggressive. They're warm. They're appreciative. Loads of touching, loads of hugging. This is the crowd that when the lights come on, they're sweaty and they're messy and they don't want it to stop.
I love a word that you keep using when we're talking about this, and that's communion. Because for me, the word communion, it's a religious word and it's a word that's all about innocence. Do you think there's something almost spiritual about that great night out?
Definitely. It's well known, the parallels between house music and the church. You know, the idea of the DJ being the kind of minister as such, you know, the DJ booth being the pulpit, the crowd being the congregation. It's similar to church in many ways. The original idea of nightclubbing, it was a sanctuary. It was a safe space for people to come together from marginalized communities and to feel at one with each other and to put the kind of prejudices and pains of real life existence behind them for a night, in the same way that church is supposed to do that. If you look at, you know, football casuals in the 80s and how the acid house explosion broke down these barriers, these kind of tribal rivalries between football gangs. And you see these kind of photographs of guys embracing and hugging and just being able to express themselves, being able to feel in this carefree way without having to kind of mask their emotions. So yeah, you can see examples all the way through from when dance music was kind of born of communion in communities that were previously at war with each other.
We're talking 2 years into a global pandemic when chances to be together and sing and laugh and embrace and dance have been really thin on the ground. How have you managed to maintain your sense of euphoria and ecstasy and delight?
Nature helps a lot. The very, very simple things. Watching tulips grow, having the time to really, really zoom in and see the bulbs come up in the spring of lockdown gave me unprecedented joy. Communion with my family, being able to be with them and again, watch them grow. I think it's about recalibrating your expectations of need. You know, there's certain things that you think you need in order to be happy. And I think we've all learned that a lot of those things are extraneous. There's basic things, nature, a big blue sky, the sound of your kids laughing hysterically with your friends, just small things. Also, music is there whether we're in the clubs or not. And it's been a very sad time for nightclubs throughout the pandemic. But music is infinite in terms of our ability to make it and create it. And there's something about singing and what it does to your body and how it makes your body feel that I think is very important as well. And I would advise anyone, whether you can sing or not, to always sing just a little bit every day.
Annie McManus, still finding joy in music. Just like the Reverend Richard Coles, who went from the choir stall to the club to the pulpit as an actual 80s pop star turned vicar. He's experienced both religious ecstasy and the ecstasy of the dance floor as a member of the communards. In fact, he was always attuned to euphoria.
I was a chorister when I was a boy, so like from the age of 7, I just loved the singing and I loved the atmosphere and stuff. But I think it fired up circuits in me which were responsive both to sort of ecstasy through music and also ecstasy through religious experience, but they're very mixed up for me.
What is ecstasy for you? Is it something that happens in your head or your body, or it unites all those different parts of you?
It's this odd experience of being taken out of yourself, beyond yourself, although you don't lose any of yourself in it. Intensity of experience, a heightening of awareness and a kind of enriching of empathy and engagement. And these moments when you think you have just experienced some transcendent reality, which is so powerful and so compelling that it makes you think that the everyday life is not the real thing. It's the ecstatic experience, which is the real thing.
Can this ecstatic experience, this feeling of having been lifted up to the next level, how long does it last?
It's an interesting one because actually when you have the experience, you feel that you are out of time. So it could last a second, but that second, when you're in it, would feel eternal, I suppose. The other way of doing it, of course, is through taking MDMA, and I did a lot of that in the 1980s. On a good night, you might get 4 hours out of it. It's interesting. I often think about that the experiences I had, say, in Ibiza in the summer of 1990 came right before the experiences I had when I walked through a church door, not as a critic, but as a believer. I sometimes think that maybe my Damascene experience, my conversion to religion, was maybe just some lingering molecules of MDMA that suddenly fired my dopamine or whatever it is it fires.
So you're constantly in a state of kind of the heyday of rave, but you happen to be wearing a vicar costume at the same time.
It's different. What I loved about Ecstasy in the second summer of love was this feeling of extraordinary unity, and all the people I was with, we felt extraordinary empathy with each other, and we were experiencing together these heights of excitement through music and through being together and through a hard night on the dance floor. Nightclub ecstasy is recreational, I think, and the religious ecstasy that is incredibly vivid in so many of the medieval mystics, for example. And when you read about it there, you realize that this is something that is not recreational, but vocational.
How do you convert these moments of ecstasy, these ecstatic states, into a mellower kind of happiness and joy and nurture? How do you carry it with you throughout your daily life?
Well, if I knew how to do that, Christianity would be top of the pops. And one of the reasons it's not is because your daily life is, of course, worrying about VAT and trying to deal with people who sometimes can be quite demanding. And I think one of the real challenges for someone like me who is a religious professional is that I have to live that life of prose without surrendering or losing or faking the poetry which came to me so readily when I first started. I lived in a monastery for 2 years, and that was kind of just a normal part of the diet. But it's much, much harder to replicate that and to uphold that when you're out in the field, which I love. The only way you can do it actually is through a disciplined prayer life, and that's through a regime in the morning and in the evening where I just tune out of the prose and tune back into the poetry as best I can.
The way you describe it, in a sense, the full euphoric meal is not going either to the church or to the club, but somehow progressing from one to the other, enjoying all those different levels of it. Do you look back on your ecstatic life and feel that you've made a progression, or are you making repetitions?
I had to go with an ecstasy sometime after I'd stopped to see if it would be something comparable to religious experience. And actually I found it not at all. It was like having been eating fine food, all of a sudden having a pot noodle.
So often we think of ecstasy as being a kind of communal experience of frenzy or congregation or prayer or celebration or mourning. And yet you mentioned the medieval mystics. It makes me want to ask, do you think ecstasy can also be an intensely personal and solitary experience?
Yes, and I think it is for me now. It's become that, really. If you look at the medieval mystics, many of them were anchorites. They were literally walled up away from human society. For me, I think it was when I was in the monastery and I acquired the habits of a very disciplined prayer life. It's then really that I feel that I am most alive to a transcendent reality.
Do you think that in everyday Christian life as a believer in the 21st century, there is a place for ecstasy and euphoria, or is it mistrusted as some kind of extremity or hysterical state?
Well, it depends on what you do. I mean, there are lots of people who do absolutely seek and uphold that ecstatic experience. There's charismatic evangelicals, there are charismatic Catholics too, where that feeling of the Holy Spirit being alive and present and giving people tongues in which they speak and extraordinary experience of being out of body. Very happy for other people to do that, but that's not what I'm doing.
Something that I love about the way you speak about ecstasy is that there's a gentleness to it and a sublime quality to it. Do you think that other interpretations of the word ecstasy are somehow misguided, that we think of them as being hysterical states or frenzied states or forms of madness?
Well, they can be that. I mean, I just can't do that. I've seen other people do it. I've marveled at it sometimes, but I've also seen things which have disturbed me. So I've seen people in ecstasy describe watching a limb that was deformed in some way grow back. And I've known perfectly well, because I've been there too, that no such thing has happened. But ecstasy has created in people this belief that they've seen the impossible. I worked for a while in Africa, in Uganda, where that kind of religious experience is very common, but it's an experience which, victimizes people, accuses them of satanic practice or witchcraft, and isolates them and demonizes them. And I don't want anything to do with that.
Apart from the sheer individual enjoyment in the moment, what are the broader benefits of ecstasy?
Yes, I think there's a greater benefit than the sort of the white knuckle aspects of it, and that is that it takes you out of yourself. And I think we live in a culture in which we are so locked into individual experience and the valuing of individual experience, that to have something that shocks you out of that is a wonderful thing. And, Sartre said hell is other people. I think it's exactly wrong. I think hell is yourself. And if you are lost in the prison of individualism, your life becomes narrow and airless and mean.
What makes you happy, Richard?
Well, what makes me happy is when good stuff happens, right? What gives me joy, and I'm more interested in joy than happiness, is that feeling when you sense, for me, it's the presence of God and the deep mystery of existence and the delight of it, and the sense that no matter what life sends you, the possibility of something wonderful and transformed beyond the horizon of our experience is there and waiting for us. And when we get there or intimate it, we think, oh yeah, there you are again.
The Reverend Richard Coles, transcendent as ever. Before you fly away on pure hedonism, though, there is substance and purpose to the ecstatic sensation. It can even be harnessed as a healing tool. Professor David Nutt is a groundbreaking researcher looking at the effects of drugs on the brain. He uses psychedelics to treat intractable depression. With him is philosopher Jules Evans, whose book, The Art of Losing Control, shows how people have sought out ecstasy since classical times.
The origin of the word is from the ancient Greek ecstasis, which means standing outside. An ecstatic experience is a moment you stand outside your ordinary sense of self. And in the ancient world, it was often tied to another experience, enthusiasmos, which is where we get the word enthusiasm, which means a god or spirit within. So the classical understanding was an ecstatic experience was a moment when you go outside of your ordinary self and you feel deeply connected to some kind of god or spirit or power. And that could be euphoric, but it could also be terrifying. It could be an evil spirit.
David, how do you in your work navigate the sense of stepping beyond oneself without harm?
Yes, that's a great question. And it particularly concerns us when we're using psychedelic drugs in people who have history of being in dark places, particularly those with depression or addictions. And the way we deal with that is essentially to prepare people for the fact that getting outside themselves may take them back to where they were before. And there is a theory that some of the problems that people have in coping with depression or addiction is because they're putting so much effort into forgetting the past or trying to hide the past that they haven't got capacity to deal with the future. So we encourage them to explore the origins of the darkness that's within, with a view then to confronting it and putting it to bed, or at least understanding that there are different ways of dealing with it. And that, of course, necessitates psychotherapy as well. So when we're using psychedelic drugs to help heal people, we are always doing it in the context of having therapy present as well.
Jules, has there been a cultural shift in the way that we see ecstasy? If I said to someone in the 21st century, right, I'm off to pursue ecstasy, I would be seen either as a deviant or a hedonist, and this would be frowned upon.
Most cultures at most times in history have had ecstatic rituals. There was a sense that ecstatic experiences could be dangerous, could be bad for you or for your society. But there were also potential benefits to this kind of experience. They could be healing, they could be connecting, they kind of take you out of your little separate self and connect you to other people, to nature, and possibly to the gods. Most cultures had kind of places and rituals to help people lose control and find ecstasy in ways that are relatively safe. What happened in Western culture was starting from, arguably around the 17th century and the scientific revolution, ecstasy was seen as simply delusional and pathological. People think they're connecting to God or angels or spirits, and they're just letting their imagination carry them away, and they're losing control, and that's bad for them and it's bad for society. And so if you look at the late 19th or early 20th century, you had pioneering psychiatrists like Henry Maudsley or even Sigmund Freud saying that religious ecstasy is basically just sickness, it's brain pathology. But I think the real shift in Western culture started in the 60s, when you get this explosion of ecstatic practices back into Western culture, like Eastern ecstatic practices, psychedelics, the whole kind of counterculture of the 60s. And it was at that moment that we began to see a shift in our public attitudes towards the ecstatic. But we still have a rather ambivalent relationship to them.
I want to put all of those points to David because they tap into your work very, very closely. David, how do you counteract these charges that you are outside of standard medical or even psychological practice? You're leading people astray, or you're just an experimenter?
Well, I am just an experimenter, I suppose, to the most banal level. But our experiments are interesting for two reasons. The first is I didn't start researching psychedelics in the brain with the anticipation of treating people's depression. I wanted to know what the psychedelic experience was due to, and we discovered that they turn off the parts of the brain which are overactive in depression. Over the last 10 years, we've done two major trials using psilocybin, which is the active ingredient of magic mushrooms, to treat depression. The first study was what we call an open study. We took 20 people who had failed on antidepressants, failed on psychotherapy. We gave them a single powerful dose, and they all got a lot better. And some are still better today, but the majority, the depression crept back over a period of months. And then more recently, we decided to compare psilocybin with one of the top antidepressant drugs. And that showed that overall, the psilocybin treatment did considerably better in terms of number of people making full recoveries.
And what is your inference, not your conclusion, but what's the takeaway from that?
Well, what we've shown is that psilocybin is as good as the best standard treatment, probably better. And this is a complete reframing, by the way, of depression. It used to be thought that depression was a mental state which was due to the absence of pleasure. But it turns out depression is an actively unpleasant state. And psychedelics disrupt that, and they allow people to escape from their depression in a way which, up till now, conventional medicines haven't been able to do.
Jules, I just want to pick you up on the sociological point that you made. You point out that perhaps a part of ecstasy and a part of ecstatic healing is moving away from individuated, internalized thinking and simply considering the self a little bit less. Do you think this is a particular malaise of the 21st century, or a particular culture, a particular way of approaching life?
I would guess that our culture is perhaps the most individualistic that's ever existed. I mean, there's wonderful things about that in terms of the choices we have, but also a burden to be tremendously self-controlled and autonomous. Aldous Huxley said that we all need holidays from the self. We need ways that we can step outside the burden of our everyday ego. And the West has been rather uncomfortable about that. But we shouldn't be. Many animals seek occasional intoxication. Humans always have.
David, what are the risks of the ecstatic route, ecstatic healing?
I suppose there are two obvious ones. I mean, the first is people change, and they then may not relate in the same way as their family and their friends as they did before. The other, I suppose, more sort of pragmatic problem is that ecstasy, for some people, can trip you into what we would call psychiatric illness, particularly psychosis or mania. And that's why we're always very cautious not to be giving strong psychedelics to people who've got that risk, because they could actually not continue to have ecstasy, but have quite a lot of suffering.
I had like a couple of bad trips when I was 18, and that led to me developing PTSD. And I had that for about 5 or 6 years. Interestingly, what eventually helped me to get over it was another kind of ecstatic experience. I had a skiing accident where I kind of fell off a cliff, and then at the moment of impact, I had one of those, white light type things, and it was very healing, and it helped kind of, again, release me from the habitual beliefs that have been causing me suffering. And in this accidental, non-voluntary ecstatic experience, I realized that I could just let go of those beliefs. People have ecstatic experiences in all kinds of ways, by the way. We shouldn't become too fixated just on psychedelics. People have ecstatic experiences in accidents, in illnesses, in childbirth.
Can I just come in here?
Go on, absolutely, David, because what Jules just said completely tallies with what you said right at the top of our conversation about breaking away those ingrained negative stories we tell ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, one of the examples I like to give is Pavarotti. So he was surprisingly but chronically depressed, and he escaped his depression when he was in a plane which crashed in Milan airport. And those near-death experiences are very transformational. And in fact, our brains are enormously efficient computers. Very often our brains are so good at being efficient that they become over-efficient and they lock people into useless ways of thinking. Sometimes it needs a jolt to break you out of that. And ecstatic experiences are probably the best, most proven way of doing that.
Is there a relationship between religious ecstasy and hedonistic ecstasy? Is there a difference between the congregation and the nightclub?
Well, I would say that ecstatic experience is not essentially good or bad. You have an ecstatic experience within the wrong context, and you could become a fanatical terrorist, for example. Within the right kind of container, it can inspire you to great deeds of like creativity or charity or service. I've certainly had experiences in a nightclub which have felt kind of spiritual. As we reintegrate the ecstatic into Western culture, we need to think about what David's colleague Robin Carhart-Harris called controlled spaces to lose control, so that we can direct this rather ambiguous experience towards pro-social kind of goals.
David, what makes you happy?
Well, I feel it's a bit banal, but I suppose it is research, but it is also helping patients. And I've been very fortunate as a psychiatrist to be able to do both.
Jules, what makes you happy?
Yeah, definitely research as well, and tennis. Tennis, 80% of the time, makes me very happy.
Jules Evans and Professor David Nutt debating the cultural and therapeutic merits of ecstasy. And now, a happy thought. In each episode, we've invited one of our favourite people to take on the theme we're exploring. And today, it's Harold Offe, the artist whose piece around the healing power of collective dance is included in Wellcome Collection's exhibition about joy. Harold uses popular culture and the body to think about who shapes history and how.
Ecstasy. It's an intense experience. It's sensual and embodied. A moment of intense presentness. But it's also something that's maybe fleeting or unobtainable. You strive for these short, intense, ecstatic moments. It represents pleasure, and obviously it can manifest itself in many different ways. Personal encounters, sexual gratification, food, drink, touch, or memories, all of which can trigger an overriding, sensual, and ecstatic moment. I think a lot about my moments of ecstasy and how they've taken place on the dance floor through movement. There's something about the relationship between dance, well actually maybe it's just best to say movement, partly because dance I think can often present an issue of value. You're either a really good dancer or you're a really bad dancer. All of which I think is irrelevant. If you can move, if you can vibrate, you can dance. Listening to Sylvester's track, You Make Me Feel Mighty Real, I think about the experiences of my body moving, often, but not always in time to the music, where there's a relationship between the movement of my body and my sense of presentness, being here and now, or there and then. It's about connections. A connection to the music, a connection to the space, a connection to other people, or just myself. So presentness and connectedness. In that moment of ecstasy, all there is the heat generated by my body. The quickening of my breath, the engorging and overwhelming of my senses. It's a strange loss of self, or is it a loss of the perception of self, through the direct feeling and power of my body. It's pleasure in the moment, and then it's gone. But I don't need a dance floor. I don't need pumping beats or sweaty crowds. The knowledge and understanding that my body can take me there and bring me back. That's enough.
Harold Offe there, motivating us to get moving. But I wonder, can you have too much of a good thing? Kay Redfield Jameson is Professor of Psychiatry at Johns Hopkins University, a world authority on bipolar illness and the manic state, and a pioneer in coming forward as someone who suffers from it herself. She's won numerous awards, including a MacArthur Fellowship, otherwise known as the Genius Grant, and her memoir, An Unquiet Mind, recounts her experience of bipolar illness. When we spoke, she described the feeling of ecstasy.
The euphoric state is really high energy, high voltage. You feel like you can do anything. You feel no pain. You feel at one with the universe. It's a sense of a really expanded consciousness where you sense everything. You can feel more intensely. It's a great feeling for a while. I think that one of the things that you could say about manic euphoria or ecstasy is that it is by definition limited. It doesn't last as long as you would like it. And very often it moves over into very disturbed and very perturbing, agitating sense. But before that, it's this wonderful sense of well-being.
You mentioned expanded consciousness. I want to link that to the idea of communion. Is it that your consciousness expands to the extent that you can sense the consciousness of others in a community together, or is it a lonely sensation?
Well, I think that one of the things that happens when you're manic is you become much more likely to seek other people out and to share the insights into the universe that you've acquired. And I think there's evidence that you actually are more sensitive to some aspects of other people. One of the things that's most common in manic delusions is religion, that sense of feeling like you're Christ or that you're Achilles, or that you are a king or Lincoln, or whatever your particular mindset is, that it's a very strong sense of identity with someone else. And that is overwhelming. But it's also a sense of communion with the stars, with snow, if you've got snow on the ground. It's a sense of just well-being that connects to everything else that's around you.
I also wanted to ask about the social effect of the manic state, because you describe so precisely that moment where you go from being the really fun, enthusiastic friend to the slightly scary, exhausting, extreme friend.
Well, sure. I think that one of the things that's, clearly the case with moods is that first and foremost, they're contagious. And that's probably part of the evolutionary basis for them, is that if you're a GNU out on the plains and you see something that's frightening, you need to transmit that anxiety very, very quickly across the herd. If people are hypomanic, mildly manic, people get, charged from it. They get agitated, they get high from it. These are social conditions in that sense, that they have a very strong effect on other people's moods and behaviors. So when you are ordinarily, reasonably rational, and all of a sudden you're not, that's a very frightening thing to be around.
After several, let's say, manic episodes, does one gain a measure of self-awareness, of kind of realizing, okay, I'm tipping down this hill and what I think is correct or logical may not be the same way to others?
I know that after I stopped my lithium a few times, very early on in the illness, I haven't stopped it since in forever, but very early on in the illness, I stopped it a few times and got manic and got suicidally depressed. And, my psychiatrist said, don't you think you've run this particular experiment often enough to know the outcome? And it's actually very true. You do learn. And I think that the consequences are so severe. And in my case, I was clearly going to die by suicide if I didn't get treated. And when I take lithium, I'm perfectly well. So I have no desire whatsoever to experiment around anymore. Been there and done that.
Is there any upside to the manic state, the euphoric state? Is there something that you miss about it when you're much more on the level?
But of course, it's great. It's you think faster, you move faster, you have more energy. You don't need sleep. Your ideas spin around much more creatively. Who wouldn't want that if it stayed there? But it doesn't. It's really like having a dual addiction. You're really, in many respects, trying to recapture the euphoria of manic states. And it makes it very difficult for some people to continue taking their medication, for example. And it would be great if it just sort of stayed at that point. But as I say, people's minds tend to splinter. It's the sort of thing that is really wonderful at a particular point in the illness. And then it's just an absolute nightmare.
What about the loss of euphoria? You've written about how terrible the side effects of lithium were for you, but I want to know if there was also a sense of grieving those very high highs.
Sure, I think it's complicated. I think that one is, first of all, I was on heavy amounts of lithium. That has changed a lot. I'm still on lithium and I don't have side effects. So, I'm a much lower level than I used to be. And I think that's true for many people who are on lithium. Certainly, I miss the highs. I miss the highs just in terms of writing and academic work and getting things done, that kind of just high energy level and easy flow of ideas, the fluency of thinking. And I tried to recapture it, and it didn't work out very well. I was able to recapture it, but the price was really heavy. And I don't even think about doing that anymore. And I think that it's not like you're going around being a dead frog or anything. You're out there living, and I don't feel inhibited from life. But I think when you're younger, you have a lot of reasons why you don't want to be taking medications anyway. And one of them is that you think this isn't going to come back.
Exactly the same onset age. is when young people are sleep deprived, they're partying, they're at college for the first time. How is it possible to distinguish between youthful hedonism and a mental illness, a clinical disorder?
Well, it turns out it's actually reasonably easy. In fact, there are a lot of very specific diagnostic criteria, and severity, length of time, family history. It's a genetic illness, and looking at that is very important. It's not to say kids don't go through turmoil when they're adolescents. It's more that adolescence, going away to university, for example, is a high-risk time for the onset of mania because A, it's the time when people are likely to get manic anyway. And B, they do the two things that we know are most likely to trigger mania, which is sleep deprivation and alcohol and drugs. So it's rather more the case that you go into situations that make it more likely to trigger your underlying vulnerabilities.
Is there something that only you know about euphoria that you could not have got to unless you'd been inside it yourself, that no amount of studying can replicate experience?
It's very hard to put words to intensity and to feeling this extraordinary sense of feeling the stars in your hands. I mean, first time I went wildly manic was at Big Sur on the Northern California coast, and there were just stars and Saturn, and I was part of the world and so forth. It's very hard to tell people what that feels like, I think, unless you've been there.
Kay Redfield Jamieson, thank you so very much for joining us. What's your happy place? What makes you happy?
My husband, my dog.
No one has said that yet. No one has yet said their partner.
Really? Well, that's too bad. I really love my husband. What can I say?
Kay Redfield Jamieson, Professor of Psychiatry at Johns Hopkins University, leaving us with the stars in our hands. And that's all from this episode of Hello Happiness, and from the series itself, which has taken us through joy, hope, resolve, and tranquility in the quest to explore the positive emotions. If you missed any of our previous episodes, please listen back wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe, spread the word, tell your friends, share it all. Welcome Collection's season on happiness runs until March 2022 with free stories, events and exhibitions on joy and tranquility. I'm Bidisha and this has been Hello Happiness. Farewell from me and the rest of the Happy Squad. Sound engineer Mickey Curling, musician and composer Schuller, producer Debbie Kilbride, and executive producer Emily Wiles.